The church was packed. The groom had come expecting a celebration. He never imagined he'd hear a decision that stopped everything. In the hail of murmurs and confusion, the pastor's voice cut through, his words ringing like a verdict. "This wedding cannot continue." The groom froze. The bride's face turned lifeless and the room went still. But this wasn't just the end of a ceremony. It was the unraveling of a life built on deception. Because the groom discovered something astonishing. He had already been declared married without ever setting foot in the church. A marriage certificate, filed without his knowledge, had landed in his mailbox. He was legally bound to someone else, someone poised to stand with him before God while he stood utterly unaware. In that moment, justice and betrayal collided, and the pastor had to decide, honor tradition or protect the truth. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was this bride, standing frozen before the congregation as the pastor's voice thundered through the church? What was she hiding so carefully behind her veil? And why did the pastor's words ignite outrage on a day meant for joy? The groom had arrived full of trust, smiling at the woman he believed was about to share the rest of his life. He had no idea that the moment he said, "I do," could bind him not just to a marriage, but to a truth he had never been told. The pastor had seen something that no one else dared to confront, and in his silence before that explosive moment, he carried the weight of a decision that could shatter lives. What secret did the bride carry to the altar? Why did the pastor risk humiliation to intervene? And who among them was protecting the truth and who was lying? To understand why this wedding was stopped, we must go back into the story of a bride who wore devotion on her face but carried questions in her silence. She appeared to everyone as pure, graceful, and deeply committed, the kind of woman who would win the admiration of a whole town. Friends would describe her as gentle, always willing to serve, and ready with a soft word for anyone who crossed her path. Yet behind that tenderness was a past she rarely spoke about. There were rumors whispered at market stalls and conversations quickly silenced when she entered the room. She was loved, yes, but also quietly questioned. And though her smile seemed to promise loyalty and her eyes suggested faith, there were parts of her life carefully hidden away, tucked into shadows that no one dared to uncover. She walked into the relationship with the groom carrying that past, hoping it would never resurface. The groom was a hard-working man, respected for the way he built his life from humble beginnings. His friends knew him as someone who never complained, who woke early to tend to his duties and returned late with calloused hands and a heart that never turned bitter. He believed in honesty, in trust, and above all in building a home that could weather storms. When he met the bride, he believed he had found the answer to the prayers he had whispered during lonely nights. To him, she was not just a partner, she was the future he had always dreamed of. His blind faith in her devotion made him ignore the whispers, silence his doubts, and embrace her fully. To his neighbors, he was a man finally rewarded with love, the kind of love he deserved after years of sacrifice. To himself, he was certain this was the woman chosen for him, a truth so sure he never thought to question it. The pastor, however, was a different man entirely. He was stern, principled, and unshaken by popular opinion. He valued truth over tradition, and though many admired his strength, some also feared his uncompromising nature. He believed that marriage was not just a ceremony, not just vows spoken before a congregation, but a sacred covenant that could not survive lies. For him, standing at the altar was never about pleasing the crowd, but about honoring what was right in the eyes of God and man. He had carried that conviction for years, even when it brought him criticism, even when it isolated him. On this day, as he prepared to join the bride and groom, his conscience would not allow him to remain silent. He had seen something that others ignored. He had recognized a truth that could not be buried beneath flowers, music, and vows. And with that truth pressing upon him, he stood ready to act, no matter the cost. But what none of them knew was that a shadow from the past was walking into the church that very day. The day of the wedding arrived with an air of celebration. Guests filled the church in their finest clothes, the choir lifted their voices, and the groom stood tall at the altar, smiling with pride as he watched his bride approach. She walked down the aisle with measured steps, her veil trembling with each movement, her hands clasping the bouquet so tightly, it seemed she feared letting go. To the congregation, it was a picture of beauty and devotion, the kind of moment that stays etched in memory. But the pastor, standing only a few steps away, was not captured by the splendor. His eyes fixed on her face, on the way she avoided his gaze, and his heart pressed heavy with a truth he could no longer keep buried. Something about her presence, about the story carried silently in her eyes, set off an alarm he could not ignore. As the pastor opened his Bible and began the vows, his voice was steady, but his thoughts raged beneath the surface. He recalled the whispers he had heard before this day, the fragments of conversations that reached him like warnings, and the paper he had held in his hands that seemed to question everything about the bride standing before him. He had dismissed none of it, though he had hoped it would resolve itself. But now, here she was, standing at the altar, her lips quivering as she repeated the words, and behind her veil was not peace, but fear. He looked past her for a moment and saw a face in the crowd, someone whose presence confirmed every doubt. It was in that instant the decision formed, as sharp and final as the cut of a blade. The guests shifted in their seats, thinking the pause in his voice was only nerves or perhaps emotion. They waited for him to continue, unaware of the storm that was about to break. The groom, smiling with expectation, leaned forward, ready to take the bride's hands as though nothing stood between them and a lifetime together. But the pastor had seen enough to risk humiliation, enough to risk anger, enough to risk being despised by the very people he served. He closed the Bible firmly, the sound echoing in the silence, and with his voice raised so none could mistake his meaning, he spoke 5 words that shattered the moment. This wedding cannot continue. The effect was immediate. The bride's bouquet slipped from her hands, the groom's smile collapsed into confusion, and the congregation erupted in gasps and whispers. Shock painted every face as the words hung heavy in the air, words that could not be taken back. The pastor stood unmoving, his eyes fixed on the bride, and though the crowd demanded explanation, he gave none. For in that instant, only he knew the depth of what had been uncovered, and only he knew that the truth would not remain hidden for long. The crowd erupted, but the secret wasn't out yet, not even close. The silence that followed the pastor's words quickly turned into chaos. Guests rose from their seats, some demanding answers, others insisting the ceremony proceed. The groom, his voice cracking between anger and disbelief, demanded the truth from the pastor. "Why stop this wedding?" he shouted, his eyes darting between the bride he thought he knew and the man of God he had trusted all his life. The bride fell to her knees, her veil sliding from her face as tears rolled down her cheeks. She pleaded, insisting there was nothing to fear, begging the pastor to continue, but he stood immovable, his Bible pressed firmly against his chest as though it were a shield. The congregation leaned in, whispers spreading like fire through dry grass. Questions erupted louder than the choir had sung moments before. Who was this woman? What had she done? Why would a pastor bring everything to a halt unless he had seen something undeniable? In the days that followed, the church became the center of rumors and suspicion. Some claimed the bride had been married before and never divorced, hiding her past beneath a new name. Others swore they had seen her in the company of a man who was not the groom, fueling whispers of betrayal. Documents appeared, some stamped and signed, but others conflicting, leaving more confusion than clarity. One set suggested she had changed her identity years earlier. Another hinted at debts and legal trouble buried deep. Each testimony contradicted the last, and every rumor seemed to tighten the noose around her reputation. The groom, once respected for his strength and clarity, now walked the streets in silence. His head bowed beneath the weight of uncertainty, unsure if he had been deceived, or if forces greater than him had tangled the truth beyond recognition. The pastor refused to explain further, holding his silence as though bound by something heavier than public opinion. Neighbors debated endlessly. Some insisted he had saved the groom from a disaster that could have ruined him. Others accused him of destroying a union that might have endured despite hidden flaws. The bride remained a figure of pity to some, and scorn to others. Her face remembered not for the joy of her wedding day, but for the tears she shed in front of everyone she had hoped would bless her new life. And still, the truth was not revealed. The weight of doubt pressed on the community like an unspoken sentence. The church pews became courtrooms, and every whisper a verdict. But then a single piece of evidence surfaced, one that exposed the truth and shattered the groom's entire world. The whispers became unbearable until one truth finally forced its way into the light. What the congregation had suspected in fragments now stood whole before their eyes. The bride had been living a double life. The evidence came like a blow, documents that bore her name tied to another man in another town, a marriage never dissolved, a promise never broken, but also never spoken aloud. For years, she had carried two identities, one of a woman eager to begin anew, and another of a woman bound to a vow she had tried to bury. The congregation, stunned and enraged, struggled to process what it meant. The groom's hands shook as he looked at the woman he thought he loved, his voice breaking with disbelief. "Tell me it's not true," he whispered. But her silence gave him the answer he feared most. In that instant, her secret was no longer hers to hide. The confrontation unfolded in front of everyone. The bride fell forward, clinging to the hem of her gown, her voice trembling as she begged for forgiveness. She tried to explain that she had been trapped in a past she wanted to escape, that she believed this new beginning would wash away her shame. The groom stepped back, unable to touch her, his face collapsing under the weight of betrayal. Around them, family and friends turned away in disgust or covered their faces in sorrow. What had begun as a celebration of love had become a courtroom, and every eye in that church was a witness to her undoing. The pastor, who had stood firm and unyielding, finally spoke. His voice was steady, his words deliberate, and the silence of the room clung to him as he explained what he had seen. He told the congregation that only moments before the ceremony began, he had been handed the evidence. A man in the crowd, one who knew the bride's past, had slipped the document into his hand. The details could not be denied, the dates could not be dismissed, and the truth could not be delayed another second. He knew then that if he continued the ceremony, he would not just be blessing a union, but legitimizing a lie. The pastor declared that his duty was not to the crowd, nor to appearances, but to truth. And with that conviction, he made his decision, even though it meant humiliation for the bride, heartbreak for the groom, and fury from the families gathered. His words were not an attack but a judgment, a declaration that the truth mattered more than tradition. The secret the bride carried was no longer hers alone. The world now knew, and the fallout was immediate. The bride could no longer hold back the truth. Her sobs echoed in the silent church as she confessed before the congregation. She admitted that she had hidden her past, not because she sought to deceive, but because she had been afraid. Afraid of losing the only man who had ever treated her with respect. Afraid of being judged forever for mistakes that had not always been hers to choose. Between sobs, she explained that the marriage the documents revealed had long since been abandoned, though not dissolved. She said she had left that life behind because it was filled with cruelty, because to remain in it would have destroyed her spirit. She had wanted freedom, a second chance, a future without the weight of chains she had not deserved. Her words poured out like a flood, but for the groom they sounded like betrayal, the kind that pierces deeper than any blade. He dropped to the floor, his hands covering his face, his body trembling as he wrestled with the impossible choice between the love he had once cherished and the truth that had broken it. The community split into factions, voices rising on every side. Some shouted that the pastor had destroyed a love that might have survived the secret, that forgiveness could have been offered if the ceremony had only gone on. They accused him of humiliating the bride, of robbing the groom of his choice to decide for himself. Yet others declared him a hero, insisting that without his courage, the truth would have remained buried, and a union built on deception would have poisoned every day that followed. Families turned against each other, neighbors refused to speak, and the very church that had once been the center of unity now became the center of debate. The bride sat alone in the midst of it all, her tears staining the floor, while the groom remained silent, unable to look at her, unable to look at the man who had spoken the words that ended everything. And then came the twist no one expected. As her confession deepened, the bride revealed that her motive had not been selfish but protective. She said the reason she had hidden her past was not to trick the groom, but to shield someone she loved, her younger sister, who had been in danger from the man she had once married. She had taken the blame, changed her name, and carried the shame so that her sister could live free from the reach of a man who would have ruined her life. In protecting her sister, she had destroyed herself. For years she had prayed for a chance to start again, and when the groom appeared, she thought her prayers had been answered. But secrets never stay buried, and the truth she thought she had carried alone became the very reason her happiness was snatched away. In the end, the wedding never happened. The pastor stood by his decision, the bride wept for the life she lost, and the groom walked out with his faith shattered. But the question remained, was the pastor a hero for stopping it, or a destroyer of love? And what would you have done if you stood at that altar? What do you think? Was the pastor right to stop the wedding, or should the truth have remained hidden? Did he act as a guardian of honesty, protecting the groom from a future built on lies? Or did he destroy a love that might have survived if forgiveness had been given? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, because this is not just their story. It is a question for everyone who has ever stood at a crossroads between truth and loyalty, between honesty and the fragile hope of love. The bride's tears, the groom's silence, and the pastor's unshakable conviction will remain etched in memory, but your perspective adds the final word. And if you thought this story was shocking, wait until you hear about the husband who faked his own death, only to show up at his wife's wedding. That story is coming next, and it is one you will not want to miss. Subscribe for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless.